Yes,
Hello?
perfect. Hello, Mary. It's
Everything's working?
yes, you can
Okay.
go.
So, good evening, everybody. Tom and I are writing a new book. This will be our fourth, and this one is called The Lean Mindset. And you'll notice that software isn't in the title because we think you have to actually think beyond software to a bigger area these days in order to be really agile. And subtitle of the book is The Difference Between Theory and Practice is Practice. And we see a lot of people talking about theory, and we see a lot of people that have to do work, and we oftentimes don't see the concept of constantly getting better and practicing, just sort of one great big jump from one to another. So the book itself is going to talk about companies that have done really well since, say, the year 2000, when internet was started to become very well used, and all kinds of things started happening. And think about it, that was well over a decade ago. A decade is an awful long time. And it's time to think about what might have happened in the last decade, and where are the companies that were just tiny little startups back in 2000 that are now great big monstrous companies like, say, Google and Amazon and those kind of companies. What kinds of things that they do that help them to thrive while other companies didn't. And so there's really 5 topics. One is the topic of cooperation. And interestingly enough, I'm really interested in the last talk today because our business world has been driven a lot by rationality. And rational people, in the strict sense of the word, are selfish people. They are looking out for their own best interests. But what you see in the digital world is much more cooperation amongst people. So how could that be? And adaptation, the ability to adapt to what's coming as opposed to having a really very long-term plan that you studiously execute. Insight. There's always a need to be able to really have insight, but particularly to understand the people and the customers and how they are going to be engaged in your product. There is always a need for a sense of urgency. Things are not slow in the digital world. And mastery, getting really good at what you do and what that means. In each chapter we're going to have a case study. Most of the case studies I still don't have permission to talk about right now, so I'll only cover a few of them that I can. But I just want to do a little bit on each one of these topics between now and, say, half past. So the first chapter is called The Triumph of the Commons. And it's about how people in the digital world have done something that in a rational world isn't supposed to work. They work together on stuff like GNU and Linux and Wikipedia in a way that doesn't make sense. In fact, the concept of we spend all of our time looking out for our own best interests doesn't really work when we say, well, how then can these things thrive and thrive for, well, I don't know, 15 years now or 20. Some of these things have been around, and what causes people to be involved and engaged in them. And what we find is that in the digital world, in the companies that are thriving, there is a lot more cooperation amongst people and teams, a lot more people working to help each other out than we see typically in the business world. So in our profession, we seem to in some way be leading an arc of change towards more cooperation amongst people and less looking out for our own best interests. And the kind of leaders that work in this kind of an environment that are thriving are people who know how to inspire passion and organize communities and make things happen. And let me talk to you about a particular person that does that. His name is Todd Park. Todd Park started up a medical company in the U.S. in the late 1990s. First of all, it was a medical clinic, but then they discovered that, you know, it wasn't as easy for Harvard business graduates to run a medical clinic as they thought it was going to be. And they'd been consultants and they thought they could do it, and they discovered that, well, real companies are a lot of work. And they found that the biggest problem was lack of access to medical records. And so he and his partner went out and focused on creating a mechanism to put medical records online. It became an extremely successful company. He sold it for a whole ton of money, had a great big IPO, and made a lot of money, and he retired, and then he decided, okay, now it's time for me to start a family and just, you know, be a venture capitalist and take it easy. But he was asked by, there he is, retired in 2007, by the U.S. H&HS Health and Human Services CTO to come and work for the government. Of all things, why should he want to do that, he said. And in fact, he lived in San Francisco, and he didn't want to move to Washington, D.C., but his wife wanted to move even less. However, he was convinced that the job that he would be given was entrepreneur in residence in the federal government, in Health and Human Services. And so he thought he'd give it a try. And he obviously didn't have any economic reason to do it, that's for sure. And what he decided to do was he looked at the databases in H&HS and he said, oh, these are great databases. Wouldn't it be cool if we could make them public? Now, remember, he had no budget. He had no people reporting to him. He was just supposed to sort of encourage entrepreneurism. So he got a few people that were interested in his idea to make their databases available to the public. Of course, they had to cover information so that no privacy was violated. And then he had to find people who would be interested in using that data to start little businesses around them. And in 2010, he released data. He got people to build applications. I mean, that's his plan. You can see what he thought he was going to do. By 2011, there were about 40 or 50 small apps out there. One of the most interesting is iTriage, which gave access to U.S. information on medical systems and medical care and all sorts of things available on a little, say, phone app. Every single company that was able to put together a business plan of how they were going to use this data was invited to a big conference. In 2012, that conference had grown to 2 days and 1,500 people, and it was called Health Data Palooza, and it became a massive movement inside of H&HS. All sorts of people were really interested in getting their data available to the public. Now, this isn't a novel thing. The U.S. Released all of its weather data to the general public about 30 years ago. And now we have all kinds of weather information channels on TV and on internet, all based on that weather data. This is doing exactly the same thing. And in 2 years, he had hundreds of applications out there and hundreds of people that were very interested in hundreds of databases that had been released. This is a painting that was done for the Health Data Palooza. He said, I didn't get the memo that this was impossible. He's one of the most inspiring and interesting kinds of persons that you might ever hear talk. And just as I heard him talk, which was March of this year, he had been appointed to be CTO of the whole federal government to try to bring these entrepreneurial ideas into the government. And he claims that the government is full of entrepreneurs that would love to do interesting things if only somebody would give them the permission to do it. That's what I mean by cooperation. Adaptation is the second one, and this chapter is called Living with Black Swans. So a black swan is an impossible thing. At least it used to be an impossible thing until Australia was discovered, and guess what? It wasn't impossible anymore. So black swans are things that are almost certainly impossible until we discover that they're not impossible. The natural disasters and economic shocks and all that kind of stuff. I mean, we just had this massive flooding in New York and the whole East Coast, another one of those black swans. So the question is, how do you live with black swans? Well, wise organizations understand that innovation is fundamental to survival and that people on the ground who have the insights into what's going on are the best ones to entrust with innovation. So let me give an example. This is an example of GE Healthcare, which has become an extremely innovative company by saying to itself a few years ago, you know what? We used to think that what we should do with our healthcare our health instruments is to develop them in, say, Europe or US, and then move them to the countries like China or India where they're going to be needed. But we might have to make them cheaper. But we start with the ones that we invented in the West. And suddenly they said, wait a minute, the real growth in healthcare is going to be in the countries that right now don't have much of any that want it. And so they started out in China, and they developed a ultrasound machine that could hook up to a laptop. It cost two orders of magnitude less, cost $15,000, whereas the existing ultrasounds in US and in Europe were more like $150,000. Over the next few years, they made it smaller and more compact, and now it is an $8,000 unit that can fit into the pocket of a rural doctor or a nurse in a hospital in Helsinki. And these things have not only become very popular in the Western world, they're one of the main diagnostic tools in places like China. Now, the interesting thing is that this was developed in China for the Chinese medical profession by a Chinese development team, because they realized that the biggest impediment was that they were selling what they were making rather than making what the customer needed. So they did it again in India, where there are more heart problems than in any other country in the world. They had an Indian team working with Indian technicians and doctors develop an EKG machine, which is so inexpensive that if a technician buys it, they can then sell EKGs for about the cost of a cup of tea. And it works all day without having to have the battery charged, because battery power is extremely, or electricity is very hard to, very unreliable. And they said that they put together engineering and marketing teams and have both of them interact closely with customers to understand the requirements, and they look at the workflow, the environmental limitations, the profitability issues, other factors when we price, design, and manufacture products. And this is my vision of what we need to think about doing in our software development world. We need to put together marketing and engineering teams that work directly with customers and truly understand their workflow, their limitations, and all of the issues, and gain real insight into what it is that they need. Because this kind of disruptive innovation that GE Medical examples here is the kind of thing that can kill companies that get too comfortable at the high end of any market. The next chapter is on insight, and here's the real issue: is not to do what we're told, but to understand what the problem is and making sure that the problem we're solving is really the right problem. Too many of our agile processes assign that job to somebody called the product owner, and hey, if the product owner gets it wrong, well, it's not the team's problem. I think that's ridiculous. I think the development team must be deeply engaged in figuring out what is the real problem we need to solve, and let's make sure that we solve the right one. If there's one thing that we know, it's that in our era, in the digital era, customer experience matters. And savvy organizations focus on the whole product, and they care about the experience. And they balance empathy with data, and they work to deliver the wow factor. So design matters. And I suppose maybe it's because this is a German conference, is that right? I'll talk about one of my favorite designers, who is Dieter Rams from Braun. And interestingly enough, the Apple designer Jonathan Ive was quite a copier of his. And if you can see, the very first iPod and the first very early radio of Dieter Rams, they don't look similar by accident. They look similar because they have the same underlying design principles, like frame the purpose, those sorts of things. So Dieter Rams' 10 principles of good design, which we need to think about in our teams, are Good design is innovative. It makes a product useful. It is aesthetic. It makes a product understandable. It's unobtrusive. It's honest. It's long-lasting. It's thorough down to the last detail. It's environmentally friendly. And it's as little design as possible. Here's a chair. It's a chair devised by Herman Miller's designers, Don Chadwick and Bill Strumpf. And when they were designing it, just about everybody thought they were crazy. It was a skeleton, not a chair. Now, I've seen these chairs around the world. I've certainly seen them in the countries that you guys are in. But when it was being designed in the mid-90s, it was thought to be silly. I'm sitting on one right now. It's really a very nice chair. And then there's these various kitchen instruments designed by OXO. And these are things that I love. I used to think that there was no way you could improve on cooking utensils until OXO came along and proved that every single thing I used could be done better if you just thought about it. So this concept of design and experience, I think, is something that we need to get involved with as we figure out what to do with our products. The next one is urgency. Okay? And in this case, I'm talking about speed to market. The fastest learner wins. If you take a look at what Android did to the iPhone, within 12 months of the iPhone out, the Android operating system was on the market. And today, it sells more phones than Apple does. It's really difficult for companies to innovate at the pace and the scale of the market. And so you have to figure out how to do a lot of experiments and keep what works, sort of being like little startup companies. So we're looking for disciplined speed, rapid end-to-end feedback, and endless learning. So one of the things that we see today, and we really see it in all kinds of areas, is much more rapid delivery of software to market, to customers, than you've ever seen before. So we see weekly, daily, and continuous delivery. In fact, one of the companies that's highlighted in this chapter is a company that's been doing daily delivery on a very, very, very large website that's an international company since the beginning. I mean, since the early 2000s. They've always done daily delivery. They just never realized that you could. I mean, even when they switched to Bill, they said, it isn't easy, but we're going to do it. When you have this very rapid delivery, Kanban works well. Iterations become, kind of almost irrelevant. Estimating is not very important. You don't have branching. You kind of have to develop on the trunk. Test and deployment automation is fundamental. Rapid cycles of learning drive your portfolio decisions. So you don't think so much about stuff like estimating and stuff. You decide what to do based on what your feedback shows you. And the team is everybody. It's not just a few people, it's everyone. And by the way, when you have this discipline, things just work. They have to work. You can't go fast without absolute quality. These are just some examples of various places that deliver fast. Now notice these are often software as a service or web-based companies, but we're finding this daily or weekly or continuous delivery moving to big companies around the world very constantly. And what it does is it just changes the concept of how you think about what software development is, because software development that's delivered every day and has feedback all the time is just a whole nother game than when you're thinking about 2-week iterations or 3-month deployments. And this constant deployment, constantly having stuff out all of the time, changes the way that you think about how you develop software. And then the last one is mastery, thriving on challenge. And a few masters that I have, they're a good musician or a good athlete. There's our swimmer. They understand what it takes to get really, really good. The long-term practice and the constant being challenged and meeting the challenge by working hard. Great organizations are much more interested in challenge than predictability. That's a pretty big mouthful. Not everybody buys it. but challenge, learning, getting better, rather than always being the same is the way to thrive when you're in a world that's changing all the time and you don't know what's next. So mastery is aspiration for something, guidance from a master or a teacher, constant progress, and perseverance, even though you're pushing up against the wall of what's possible and pushing it out. So if we look at the last example that I have here, and I got a little bit of time and even maybe some time for questions after that. I can't give you the case study that I have for this chapter because it's still not approved. It's written, but it's not approved. But I want to go back to another interesting example, and this starts out in 1896, where some people were trying to fly machines. This is Otto Lilienthal. He made over a decade or 12 years all kinds of flights. He wrote the book on lift and created constants, and everybody copied him. And unfortunately, in 1896, he was killed in a glider crash. Now, over in the U.S. in Dayton, Ohio, the Wright brothers were bicycle mechanics, and they heard about Lilienthal's death, and they were quite upset. But they also realized that, and at the same time, another glider pilot was killed in London, that the biggest thing that was missing from everybody that was trying to fly, now I'm not talking about balloons, I'm talking about heavier than air flight. The biggest problem was nobody really was able to control these flying machines unless they shifted their weight. So they came up with the concept of changing the shape of the wings. You can see that over on the right-hand side. Changing the shape of the wings of a glider would be able to give it control. And they made one, okay? And they tested it. You can see right now there's not even anybody in it. They just flew it, and they found out, hey, changing the shape actually works pretty good. And so then they built one that they decided to fly. And here they are. They went out to the ocean, which was a long drive back before cars, or they had a truck, but it wasn't common. And they spent the summer trying to figure out how to get this glider to work. Now, as they were driving there, they thought they were going to be able to spend hours up in the air. They used all of Lilienthal's constants, and they figured that it should work. And it didn't. It was hard to fly, and they didn't fly it very much, and they were very puzzled. So they asked some experts and got some advice, and in 1902 they tried some more, and it didn't work very well either. Okay, so here we go. And so they were here they are. So they were very disappointed. And so what they decided to do was they decided that the constants that they were working with for lift were wrong. And they created a wind tunnel. You can see the wind tunnel here. And they created all kinds of little foils for wings and stuff like that. And they tested it in the wind tunnel to see which one gave the best lift. And over the winter, between 1901 and 1902, they completely rewrote all of the tables on aerodynamic lift. They knew more at that point about what causes planes to, wings to lift in the air than anybody, because they did all of the experiments over the winter. And then they built this the next spring. And here they are the next summer, in very good controlled flight. You can see a couple of modifications across the back. There's a vertical tail and a few things like that. And finally, they were actually able to fly. Once they got it flying, they knew that it was just a matter of time, if they put an engine in it, that it would be able to fly with an engine. And that's because their wind tunnel experiments gave them the discipline to figure out exactly how they had to design it in order to make it fly. And having all the data, it took only one try to get it right. And by the way, they did this because they didn't have a whole lot of money. They could only afford about $1,000 every summer to build a new one, and they didn't have any time to do this for years and years by experiment, so they got the data. After they got it flying in 1902, they built an engine. They tried to get a car company to build them an engine, but they couldn't. So they used the wind tunnel to see how much it had to weigh, and they designed their own, and they had their bicycle shop mechanic build this engine. And they put it on the airplane, and in 1903, in December, they were flying. It didn't take long for this invention to move around the world. By 1919, that's 16 years later, a plane flew across the Atlantic Ocean. It took a very short time for this invention to become spread widely throughout the world. So this is a concept of having a very disciplined approach to discovering what it is that you need. You have to have insight, you have to have urgency, but you also have to have a lot of discipline and data in order to be successful. So I guess that's about all the time I have. I think it's exactly half past, so I suppose that I didn't leave time for questions. Do I need to switch this back over to somebody?
No, Mary, now we are. You reach actually punctual as possible, but I think we should have at least one or two questions now. I think the best would be when you just raise your hand, then Christoph could hand over the speaker ball to you, and then you can ask your question. Or feedback, or whatever.
Question? Or feedback, or something else? In between, I perhaps could ask my own question. Mary,
sure.
You have been talking about that everyone in a big, or even in the government, there have been entrepreneurs. But there was a statement from you, if someone is giving them allowance or authority to do so, what do you think is needed that somebody lives with his entrepreneurial ideas?
What Todd Park said was that there were a lot of entrepreneurs in H&HS, database administrators, developers, but they always had to go to work and do what they were told. And what he did is he came to work and gave them an idea. What if you could figure out how to make your database available to public so they could do all sorts of interesting things with it? And all he did was create an environment in which they had an idea, and he would say, it's okay, you can do it. He didn't have money, but he did have authority. And his authority was to be able to tell people, you are allowed to do this. Here's the web portal. He helped them figure out how to get started. He created small teams of different kinds of people to encourage each other. And he just made the atmosphere in such a way that a few people got started. And then once they got started, his idea was to spend his time marketing the data to the outside world. And as soon as he found an outside partner for the inside people, they started having a great dynamic between them. The outside company would tell the database folks, well, here's the kind of things that I need. Here's the format that would be useful. Here's the kind of frequency that I could use the data at. Here are a few more things I'm looking for. And so these teams started out sort of being little tiny businesses, and what they did was they created a platform. And he helped to find a website where the platform could be. He helped to find all sorts of people that were interested. And it was so successful, I mean, so many successful businesses were created that everybody discovered that this is how they really felt like spending their time. And so the various programmers and DBAs, especially in H&HS, started becoming involved in these little entrepreneurial teams, and they were able to. And they'd never thought about it before. They just needed somebody to give them sort of the permission. It's okay to do this. This is a fine way to spend your time. Now, at the top of the organization was the guy that hired him and told him to figure out how to make that happen.
All right. Thank you. I think this is very inspiring to hear about this. Stefan, it's your turn.
Thank you very much, Mary. I think during the break we will probably have more time for questions if someone has some in the audience.